So this week we're on the power and conflict poems. And as usual, the point behind this is me trying to give you a chance to push up to the highest levels. And there's no doubt that one of the problems that I see every time marking the power and conflict poems is a tendency of people not to have to answer the question with this. They do really, really well in spectacles, answer the question, big thesis state and all that. But then if they want to get to power and conflict, they just want to basically vomit out everything they remember about the poem. Answering the question is right at the heart of it. And using poetic techniques and looking at the poetic techniques and how they work is there. So I'm going to focus in on a poetic technique that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily pay a great deal of attention to, but I think can make a difference to an awful lot of your responses. And that's the idea of the role of the narrator. Now, remember, we should never assume that poetry is written by the poet or written with the poet's voice, okay? Never assume it's them themselves. Okay, there's situations like in Exposure where clearly Owen experienced that and he's writing about it. However, even then he's writing in a we, first person plural voice, so he's not writing from his perspective. And there's some cases in which the voice, the speaker, is blatantly, obviously a narrator we should listen to as a character. And so that's what I'm going to really focus on today in two particular sections. Now, the first one that I'm going to look at is the idea, I'm just going to take two poems as an example here. There's other ones that go with it. Two poems here. The example of where what the poet is doing is choosing a narrator to limit our perspective. Something that we're familiar from in terms of prose and novels and stories like that, where we see it through one person's eyes and therefore we don't see anything beyond what they are aware of. And by doing that, it really focuses us on character, but can also make us look at things slightly differently. Now, I'm going to use the prelude as a key example. And remember, this is one poem that hasn't come up yet, so could well be one that does. Background information isn't necessarily hugely important, but there's a reason why I bring this up, which I think you mostly know already, that this is an extract, where it's from the prelude, from a and it really is a long piece of writing. It's a 400, 500 word novel written in poetry, all about Wordsworth's youth and his time growing up. You see the subtitle, The Growth of a Poet's Mind, tells you immediately, as well as the fact he worked in it throughout his life, that the focus is on self and the construction of self. So what he's telling us in this extract from the prelude, he's saying, here's an incident that shaped me. Okay? So when we're looking at it in terms of power and conflict, we're looking at the impact on him. And particularly in terms of conflict, we're looking at the internal conflict, because that's what he's suggesting to us. He is growing, he is learning, his mind is growing, and therefore we can approach that from here. And even the impact in there, a few more. Even the impact. Girls, we're not coming in. Oh, that's great for the recording there, isn't it? A dramatic entry from Mr. Atkins. I will name him and shame him there. Right. The idea that in the prelude, then, what we're doing is he's retelling a memory, and therefore telling it from our point of view. Now, if we think about memories, what we're always, our memories, the memories that we have, right? They're not accurate. We don't remember things photographically. We don't remember things in a way that gives us actual, exact experiences that we had. They tend to mix together and merge. And we need to look at it from that way, that this is somebody telling a memory from his perspective. And therefore, his choices are what's important. So if we think, for example, about these early quotes at the beginning, he starts, as we know, saying that he was led by her. I'm sure you've had conversations about who her is. Is it nature? Is it whatever? But remember, that is him saying he feels he was led by her towards it, which is therefore telling us something about him at that moment, that perspective. He keeps it clearly felt he's at one with her, nature, or whatever, at that point. And then when he unloosed the chain, we obviously see the metaphorical aspect of that. Yes, he's taken the chain off that was holding the boat there. But he unlooses the chain, and metaphorically, you know what that means. It means he feels he's freeing the boat. It's making it free, and therefore this whole action is about freeing things. So again, telling us where he is in his mind at the beginning. And to call it then an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, the oxymoron, particularly of troubled pleasure, shows us where he was. He's claiming freedom. He enjoys it, but of course, at the same time, he knows there's an element of doing wrong. So it places us very clearly where he is in his mind at that point. And I think that's a great way to start in terms of the idea of the internal conflict that comes through this. Because then we move on, and there's all this lovely description of nature, him being at one with nature, him seeing the beauty of it. I love the small circles glittering. I think it's a beautiful description. But what we then begin to see is how those link with what happens later. These are connections. Early on, when everything seems wonderful to him, he says, far above was nothing but the stars. After the mountain emerges, or the crag emerges in front of him, he says it towered up between me and the stars. So you can see from his perspective, he's using the stars as something that initially expand and his whole universe and the beauty of what's above him. But he's suggesting that this event felt like it was blocking him. It was coming between him and what those stars represented to him. And when we go to again here, there's no doubt that there's a deliberate connection between mentioning the silent lake and the silent water. It's just too obvious with the description for it to be otherwise. Again, the first one here is before he has the experience, the second is after. And we see that the oars are repeated as well. So the two actions are paired. So to begin with, he's putting his oars into the silent lake, and he says he's doing it lustily. Yeah? Again, full of excitement and enthusiasm. Right? That's how he feels at that point, putting his oars into there. But later on, of course, it's for a different purpose he puts his oars into the boat. It's to get away. And then the oars become trembling oars. A perfect example of a transferred epithet, it's called, where you take the description of yourself trembling and attach it to an object that you've got there. So the oars are trembling, but in reality it's him. But you see how that then shows you the difference in the purpose from lustily dipping to trembling. And the silent lake purely just becomes silent water, which he has to steal his way through. The silence that seems so beautiful here becomes sinister. And the point I'm making overall is, what we're seeing is therefore the change in his mind, in his head, in his perspective. In that instant, he begins to see things differently. He sees the world as threatening, as difficult, as unpleasant. Now, as with all memories, we like to think of the significance. You'll always hear people say, and it was at that moment that I decided, and it wasn't. You know, we decide things gradually, but people like to order it that way. And therefore, he gives great significance to this event. And therefore, and the most important thing I would say about the prelude, yet one of the most ignored things, I mean, if it does come up, let's say, I would expect to be reading loads and loads of answers talking about the power of nature, talking about the mountain coming up, and nothing more. But the ending is hugely important to any conversation about the prelude, because this is where he sums up exactly what has happened to him, what effect it has on him afterwards. And I think in particular what's up there at the beginning, I always like the phrase, because it's a very confusingly written bit, but I think that echoes how he's a bit confused and trying to suggest what he's going. This idea of his brain working with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. That phrase, if you can hold on to that, it's a very, very effective one to discuss. Unknown modes of being. It sums up what's happened to him and how he feels. a mode of being, a method of existence, a way of existing, previously unknown to him. That's what's happened to him. He's living in a way that he never knew of before. But again, this word being, I know it's a being, it's about existence. It's about a change in how he views existence. And he links it in, of course, to the change in nature, the familiar shapes, the pleasant images, changing into huge and mighty forms, the repetition of that early word huge, that move through his mind in the day and become a trouble to his dreams. But again, notice it's moving through his mind in the day and it's become a trouble to his dreams at night. Again, it is internal. So the use of the narrator here, limiting our perspective, so we see what's apparently a completely unimportant event that he notices amount that he didn't notice before, right? It becomes significant because of what it says about him and about his internal conflict that he didn't even know existed before it began. Now, London does a similar thing, but it does it for a different purpose. Again, it's first person. Again, we have a clear narrator. We mustn't mistake it as Blake. May well be he intended it to be, but we will always talk about it as the speaker. And that speaker expresses emotion. And London is a poem about emotion. Yes, it gives you all those social issues within it, but it's about emotions. It's about anger primarily. Somebody getting angry, as so many of us will do, when we notice something awful happening that people are ignoring, and obviously deliberately ignoring. So how does he do it? He builds emotion through his use of the technique of repetition. He repeats those words, as we know repeatedly, are marked at every place I meet, and every place I meet, marks of weakness, marks of want. Hitting that word mark, even when it's double meaning, hitting the same with every cry of every man in every infant's cry of fear, and repeating cry, as he does as well, not only makes us focus on those words, but it does suggest somebody who is limited in their expression at that point because they are so emotional about what they're feeling. They're building emotions at that point. Remember, just before this, we've got that flowing, I wandered through the charted stream near where the charted Thames does flow. Now, it's all very gentle because that appears to be that way, and then the emotion builds. We get his anger coming through cacophonic sounds, unpleasant sounds, harsh sounds. London's a poem that deals with sound. It should be heard aloud, read by somebody who reads it well, okay? Because so much of it comes out in hearing. He uses all these plosives all the way through. The plosives, the words that are made by kind of pushing the lips together. The buzz, the muzz, the puzz, right? And they're everywhere in that poem, okay? As it goes further on, because to make a plosive sound, you have to literally push your lips out like that together, and it's very aggressive. And he does the same with sibilants, which we know is a repetition of the sound. And when it's harsh, the sibilants like that, it's again almost hissing. So he's using those to express his anger. Again, it's the voice of the narrator that is giving us the emotions rather than what he's saying. Okay? The fact he repeats, the fact he uses cacophonic sounds. And then the fact that he chooses to direct his anger at institutions. Now, in each of these cases, these follow the three key people in the second half that he goes to. The chimney sweep, first of all, the soldier, and then the young harlot. And what he does is he basically attaches each one of those to an institution he thinks it's showing up. And it is a personal opinion. When he says the chimney sweep, the cry of the chimney sweep, every blackening church appalls. I mean, what has the chimney sweep's cry got to do with the church? Only by extension, by the fact he seemed to be suggesting to us the church should be doing something about it. What's a church for? It should be looking after children, right? And it's blackening their name not to do so. When it uses this very abstract image of running in blood down palace walls to go with the soldier as he stands there sighing, again, yes, it suggests that come revolution, and of course this was written, 20 years after the French Revolution. So the threat of a bloody revolution coming up against the higher classes was very, very upper in people's minds, very high in people's minds. The suggestion is, if a revolution like this comes, who's the one going to be mown down? It's going to be the soldier. His blood will run down the walls of the palace, and the walls will still be standing, and the monarchy are behind it. But it's still an interpretation, pointing out that it is the palace behind where the monarchy sits that will not be affected. And then at the end, that really haunting oxymoron, the marriage hearse, which goes to the young prostitute again. Many have suggested, okay, it has to do with the idea of diseases being spread through marriages, through, people doing prostitutes, all that kind of an idea. But the point is, he's going at the institution of marriage, and he's particularly therefore going at, I think, the institution of the middle class, and pointing out the hypocrisy that they are bringing death to what should bring life, the marriage, lies spreading this disease by basically their lies, by them going out and essentially, while they're married, hiring young prostitutes. And he uses the word young and never specifies how young. I think probably luckily for us. So you see what I mean? As well as using techniques that very much come from the narrator, here he's directing us to feel a particular way. So there's two examples that show you how, by limiting your perspective to one person, you can affect the way that we see the power and conflict ideas within it. And that allows me to take you on to the next step, which is a concept you may have come across before, the idea of the unreliable narrator. This is used a huge amount in literature, and certainly any further study beyond GCSE, you'll encounter it a lot. The unreliable narrator refers to the idea that we are told a story or told something by somebody who may not be telling us the truth. Because let's face it, you tell someone a story, you're not necessarily telling the truth, you're telling them at best your version of the truth, at worst a completely invented story. And here's three examples in which the unreliable narrator appears. Now, My Last Duchess obviously came up very recently, so it's very unlikely to come up, but it may well be that some of you in here feel that you could use it. It's a very complex poem, it's a very good poem, but of course it deals with a first-person narrator speaking in a particular situation. And there is absolutely no doubt that he is doing this for his own purposes. And so the story he's telling us, we start to doubt. And this is a technique that Browning uses in the other collection of poetry, Love and Relationships. There's a poem by Browning called Porphyria's Lover, in which we use a similar device. And about halfway through the poem, or just before that, you start to really think to yourself, hang on, this guy's completely misunderstanding what's really going on. And I think we get a similar thing in My Last Duchess. Now, for example, take the image of Fra Pandolf. Remember the painter who painted this picture that's in there. He tells us about when Fra Pandolf painted and possibly flirted with his wife. But of course, he uses the word perhaps because he wasn't there. He doesn't know. And therefore, it changes our interpretation because the entire thing is an invention of his mind. And that tells you something about somebody's mind. If he's sitting there not only thinking that maybe the painter flirted with his wife, he's actually imagining entire lines that the painter said. He's creating a scene in his head. This is somebody disturbed who feels a lot more about this incident than he claims he does. When he says, oh, it was all right, doesn't matter. It clearly does. He's been festering about this. And he imposes his own ideas on this. I look at this, the line here, Fra Pandolf supposedly says. It's clearly in his words. And look at the mention of the idea of the faint half flush that dies along her throat. Funny enough, in that other poem I mentioned, Paul Pierce Loving used the word throat like that then. Now you think to yourself, the word throat, see, it's a neck. Anyone normal would say neck here. Why throat? Anytime you think of throat, you think of strangling, right? You think of choking. Are we getting language here that is suggesting to us the true feelings of the Duke at this particular point? Or to go back to the theme I was on earlier, as so often is said by Big Right about My Last Duchess, that the husband of the Duchess is apparently the Dutch, but never mind. So he then goes on to carry on playing with the listener, messing around. Now, that's not us. I'm not saying the audience, the listener. Remember, this is a technique where he is talking to a specific person, a man who is up there, who's obviously a servant, a personal assistant of this count, we find out later, whose daughter he's going to marry. And he's been showing him around, and he stopped and showed in this picture because he's basically threatening him, right? We find that out at the end. So he plays around with that listener as he talks to him. This one, when he has revealed the picture to him and says, I've drawn back this curtain. I mean, one of the rules of this kind of technique, dramatic monologue, is that during it, the other person, the listener, might actually speak, but it's not recorded in the poem. And clearly, the person looking at the poem, the listener, has said, oh, that smile, where's that come from? And if you remember it, the Duke's response is to turn to him and go, ah, yes, you're not the first person who's asked me that. I'm the only person who ever opens it. So if anyone sees it like that, it's me they'll ask, and you're not the first person to ask me that. But he doesn't say you're not the first person to ask me. He says the first person that seemed as if they would ask me, if they dare, if they dare. It's a veiled threat, isn't it? You know, ah, yes, you asked me. Yeah, lots of people seem as if they would ask me if they dared, and you dared. Just watch it. You know, it's a veiled threat underneath that goes in there. Then he does this a couple of times where he uses a rhetorical device, this thing where, you know, people stop and it's like they're actually stopping and thinking, how do I put it? But if anyone says that to you, go, I wanted to say to you, how shall I put it? They're not really thinking of how they should put it. It's a rhetorical device where they're about to put it in very gentle terms and you should take it worse. And that's what she does. Her heart too soon made glad. In other words, I'm deliberately giving you an understatement there. It's worse than that. He messes with her through that voice, with the listener, through that voice. And later on when he says, at one point talking, even if you had skill in speech, which I have not, and that's in the middle of a poem from somebody who is one of the most eloquent people you've ever heard. And that's clearly somebody saying that kind of thing when they know they've got skill in speech. So to hear him mess with the listener points out to us very clearly that he's got an objective here. He's concerned with his power. He's concerned with controlling his speech perfectly. And we're doubting him. And that becomes even clearer when the motive finally becomes clear later on in the kind of very complex phrase that I'm sure you've dealt with before, where, again, he goes off on one of his, very eloquent phrases. The count your master's no munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be allowed. A point at which he's basically saying, don't forget, I want this dowry, remember, amount of money that's paid to somebody when they marry by the father of the bride. I want this amount in my dowry and I'm going to get it. Because that's the whole point. It's been a threat the entire way along. Clearly, especially as he says, I repeat before this, clearly this is where it all started. He brought up the dowry. There was a bit of a, yeah, maybe, doubt over whether he was going to get the money he wants. And so he says, let me show you around. Takes him off. I'll show you this picture. I'll tell you the story of my last Duchess, because I know it's going to lead up to the fact I had her killed. And therefore you're going to understand how serious I am and how serious it is if I marry somebody. So his motive is revealed so late on, and it's revealed without him telling us exactly what he means, but we get it by that point. But even then, we start to think about the reality of the situation. I mean, does the Count at that point, when this is reported back to him, say, oh, well, I better give him what he wants? Or does he say, I'd not marry my daughter to someone who murders their wife? Depends how just the Count is. But you get the sense of what I mean by an unreliable narrator. Look at them. What they say isn't necessarily what we think. Now, this moves a different way with Kamikaze, for example. Kamikaze in particular, because we think about certain questions with it. First of all, who is the narrator? Well, of course, it starts right at the beginning. And when this came up last year on the poems, so many people completely misunderstood this and thought it was his wife talking and got completely confused. It clearly starts up at the beginning that this is his daughter who we're seeing this through the eyes of, because it's her father. And in fact, we then begin to realize, as we go further on, therefore, if she's telling us the story, how does she know this story? First of all, two moments come in the second stanza where it says, as he flew over, she thought, he must have done this, which tells you that she doesn't know. She doesn't know this story at all. She is guessing. This story is an invention of hers. And of course, that's obvious when you stop and think about it. Look at the details like that, arcing in swathes like a huge flag about the... How would you know those details from a story that happened to somebody else long before you were born? And of course, even more obvious, how would you know that story when the person it happened to came home and nobody ever spoke to him again? How did he tell you that story? Because the entire point behind it is it's an invention of hers. And why has she invented this story? Because she's his daughter. Remember, in the story, the motivation for him to turn around is this memory of his family, of him and his brothers sitting there waiting for the father's boat, as it says here, to come home safe. The idea that he is sat there thinking, oh yeah, I remember how much that meant to me that my father came home safe. I better go home safe. Right? That's what it appears to us to be. But she is telling a story she, as we said, thought, must have invented. And why would you as a daughter invent that story? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Our father, nobody speaks to him. He's dishonored. He's dishonored the entire family. He's dishonored the entire family. Well, he did it for the good of us. Essentially, in terms of the story, I often think when you look at it, well, why did he turn around? He was a coward, probably. Although, to be fair, someone condemned him for not flying his plane into a boat. That would be stupid. But, you know, that's why he did. He was scared. But she's going to invent a different way. And then that gives us a completely different interpretation of the story. And the final third one of this is then just the emigre. Another strong potential to come up this summer. Now, this is different because the emigre is about a narrator who admits her own unreliability. That's the entire point. The entire point, she's telling us a story that's in her head. In the very first stanza, she begins, there once was a country, telling it like it's a story to us. She refers to her view of her country as a bright-filled paperweight. Quite clearly, she's not seeing this as something realistic. Its purpose is like a paperweight, to hold down her life, maybe, ornamental, whatever. It's made clear. And then when she goes on to tell us more about that view, it's all very idealized. She describes the white streets of the city. I mean, what city has white streets? If they're painted white, they might be white for 20 minutes, but pretty soon they're going to be turning grey, black, with pollution, etc. You don't get that. The graceful slopes that are glowing. This is clearly idealized, but she's made us aware of this. This isn't reality. It's about the way and the power of memory. She's talking about what is in her head, maybe unreliable, but it's more important than the reality. And then the final stanza's invention. I was working with somebody from another school not long ago on this, and they've been told this thing about that she goes back to the country at the end, which is quite ridiculous. Obviously, the last stanza begins, "I have no passport, there's no way back at all." She doesn't go back. It's clearly all in her head. So what she then does is invents this story at the end about going back, about being surrounded, whatever. It's all fantastical. She's leaving her own city through a different city. The point being that this is her imagination of how it might be if she went back, and how different it is, and how the two would conflict. And then that final line, so important, "my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight," isn't about reality. She didn't stand there, see her shadow and go, yes. If I have a shadow, it means there must be sunlight. No, it's a metaphorical thing saying, if I can imagine a shadow, I have to be able to imagine sunlight. If I can imagine darkness, I have to imagine the light that created it. And therefore, there must be good. The whole thing is a known invention of her because that's the point. It makes more sense. So what I'm trying to get across to you here about the role of the narrator is essentially that often the choice of a narrator and the use of a narrator, a speaker, provides us with a limited perspective deliberately. It cuts out, this is not just true of drama, it's true of everything. It cuts out everything that they don't want us to see, okay? And therefore, we may well doubt the reliability of it, but that may not be the point. What it can also do, you see, is it directs our empathy. They can direct our empathy in a particular way by making us feel something. Remember that narrator in London picking out the church to criticize from the chimney sweep? Okay, something he needs to draw us towards. But it can also, as we saw with my last touches, create insights and emigrate into that actual central character themselves, showing us what kind of a person we are talking about, giving us some characterization, and particularly in terms of power and conflict, the way they exercise their power and the way that the conflict afflicts them.